effects that are in the environment, even in thought, meditative states, that turn on and off what used to be called junk DNA. And now they're finding that, in fact, it's not junk DNA, that this other genetic code lights up and turns on and off depending on environmental or epigenetic influences. So the question becomes, there's much more to us than meets the eye from the Human Genome Project. Now, no one can prove at this point how it is that Homo sapiens came to their modern state. There's a gap missing that's known scientifically. And the other question is, if the study that just came out, that's actually on our website, SiriusDisclosure.com, that says that if you were to take the natural evolutionary pattern, our genetics should have taken about 10.5 billion years to just evolve through evolutionary theory. But the Earth is only 4.5 billion years old. Sum that up. And this is in a mainstream genetics journal. So, there are many mysteries locked within us, within the Earth, and what have you. And this is what we're running into with this little creature that you saw. Now, unfortunately, the media, which don't generally have good scientific people on their staff, no offense to any media here, but the geneticists at Stanford, no geneticist is going to say that's an extraterrestrial biological entity, what's called an EBE, because there's no genetic database. So the way the genetics were done on that, just so you all know, is that let's say the Human Genome Project was done there outside D.C., and I know people who worked on it. You had about over a decade, billions of dollars, and they finally figured out the human genome. Now what they did was take 2,500 ethnic, racial groups from all over the world, put it into a database, which is now computerized. When I clipped, well, you saw we took the ribs, the anterior lower rib off the right side of this little creature, and when we took that, I could see we had good bone marrow. So we were able to get a very perfect sample. It was not degraded. It was not like CSI where you have to do a lot of PCR, polymerase change reaction replication, where you get a lot of error. Very pure. Although we think it's 100 or 200 years old, it was very good DNA. So what that was, it was processed as older DNA, what's called ancient DNA, which means from a corpse. Doesn't mean thousands of years old. That's the term used in genetics, ancient. Ancient being more than 50 years. And, or not fresh. I mean, the blood, my blood, yours would be fresh DNA. So, okay, I know everyone's going to glaze over because I'm a nerd. I'm going to go into some science here. So, I just look stupid. So, my bodybuilding buddies, I bench press 410, they go, you're not as stupid as you look. I said, thanks. I know, outrageous person. So we looked into this, and when they ran it, again, at the 3 top labs in the world, and it was headed up by Stanford, 91% matched to human, 9% matched to nothing, unmatched. Now, of course, you can say, if it was a bad sample, you can say, well, it was all computer error, junk DNA, what have you, but this was not a bad sample. So the genetics team have privately told me the expectation would have been 2 or 3%. High number, 4 or 5%. Now, just so all of you know, we're 96 to 97% identical to chimpanzees. Neanderthals are 99.5% identical to humans, and to some guys even more so. So, us guys. So, Neanderthals. So, when you look at that, if half of that unmatched DNA is what's called an operational gene, that would make that creature more different from us than we are from chimps. Now, people say, well, why don't you know? I said, because the easy part was taking the sample, flying to Barcelona, running it through these computerized databases. Now, what we have to do, and I'm going to make this announcement here in London, first time, we're going to have, there's a big, huge biotech company called Ingenuity, huge. They're going to offer a major cash prize to thousands of PhDs all over the world. We're going to dump the database into access to these PhD geneticists so that they can pick through the 2 million base pairs that are unmatched. The question is, why is that much unmatched? Wasn't a bad sample, certainly not all computer error. And the bigger mystery, which you may have picked up in here, is that this is a 6 to 8 year old creature, but it's 6 inches, 13 centimeters. Now, I can tell you as an emergency doctor, I've delivered many premature babies that have come out, you know, one push and they're out, you know. But, you know, they're this big or this big. They're not that big. They're not the size of a 15 to 18-year-old fetus. But if you look at the epiphyseal plates, which is what the top expert in the world at Stanford looked at, it's 6 to 8 years old. So there's an enigma here, wrapped in a mystery, you know, just completely unknown. We hope that if we set loose thousands of PhD geneticists around the world at the best institutions, they will be able to pick through these 2 million base pairs, which could be up to 1,000 genes, and figure out what's going on with this specimen. And nobody knows yet. I can't tell you it's ET, but no one can tell you it's actually human either, because something's not adding up. Now, since the film was completed in early April, it was just completed, we found out that there are 2 or 3 more of these. One in Russia that was confiscated by the KGB, the FSB, back in 1996. I have video of it. Another one that's in Chile that's 3 inches big. That's just like this creature. And another one that was found in Puerto Rico. Now, if we can get access to the genetics of any of those and they match up to this one, it's case closed. Now, to answer, you know, you're going to find when you ask the question, I'm going to go off into deeper and deeper issues that are disturbing. You know, as Gloria Steinem said, the truth will set you free. First, it will piss you off. So Vatican, close your ears, and the fundamentalist Christians, because here I'm going to say something. It appears that in this creature, there is what's called the B2B as in boy 2A allele. Now what that allele is that it matches to the native people of that part of the world in Chile on the female mitochondrial DNA. Well, what is that doing in those women, or what is it doing in this creature if it's not human, if it's not a Homo sapien? And what you begin to realize is that if you go to these areas where there are the Nazca lines, where there are the Mayan and Inca cultures, where there are drawings and petroglyphs, and in their tradition they had ancient contact with people from the stars. I believe your Celtic and Gaelic people here did. I think the ancient Egyptians did. This is my own view. But is it possible that there was some genetic commingling that happened 50, 100,000, 200,000 years ago? Probably. And so what we're going to have to do is map these alleles. Now, this is going to rock. I mean, you can imagine the people who are not going to be happy. All archaeology, all historians, all anthropology, all conventional genetic thinking, evolutionary thinking, not to mention jet propulsion labs. And that's why this is so explosive and why we're going to run it to the ground as much as we can. How long will that take? I would estimate between 2 and 5 years, unfortunately. Because now is the hard part. You have to go through 2 million base pairs and pick them out, one by one. Keep in mind, in a normal genetic study, if you don't know what a grouping of DNA is doing, you do what's called a mouse study. Because mice and mice and men, we're 70% identical genetically. So what is normally done at a place like Stanford or Harvard, MIT, I don't know, maybe Cambridge, is that you would take a genetic series, you'd put it, snip it, replicate it, put it into a mouse, and see what it does. Each one of those studies, and we may have to do 1,000 of them, is at least $500,000 per mouse study. So that's $500 million. I'm not walking around with that kind of money. The United States government does, maybe your government does, well, they're all bankrupt. But they'll just print more. Well, that's for Nazi to print up on 500 nights. So this becomes a daunting task for this one genetics lab, even though it's one of the premier labs in the world. And this particular scientist, Dr. Nolan, you know, he has like 40 PhDs working under him. He's an absolute genius. But it's beyond what he can take on. He's an endowed chair there. And he was able to do this work for us pro bono for free because he had discretionary funds under his endowment as an endowed chair at Stanford. So we have a great debt of gratitude to Dr. Nolan. So that's the big part. I think a more interesting part is the clinical picture, because the people I've run into since this has come out in the last 60 days are some people who went down there to where this creature was found, and they found in some of the old mining areas where they had were digging in the late 1800s, they would cut into what were these underground cities. And apparently, Ed Snowden, the NSA leaker, put out in part of his thing that there were documents dealing with ultra-terrestrials. There were ETs that had taken up residence on Earth and were living underground, which is what they're called. If true, that would be interesting. So what we really need to do, we need to go to the Atacama Desert. We need to have ground-penetrating radar, ultrasound, archaeology, da-da-da-da-da. But it's, you know, beyond the scope of our funding at this point. And if I had it, I'd have to make the decision between that and opening a new energy lab, which is what we really want to do, so we could say goodbye to oil and coal and nuclear power and the grid. You know, this film was really conceived as a fundraiser and an awareness-building project so that we could transition out of the 1800s where we are stuck. Our civilization is stuck in the mid to late 1800s. Your car engine, 1880s Mercedes. The electric grid, 1800s, late 1800s. Look at photographs of London and New York in the late 1800s with the wires. Coal-fired power plants, same thing. Nuclear power plants, it's just heat from splitting an atom, but you're running a steam turbine just like the 1800s, choo-choo trains going across the west. Jet engines, all right, 1930s. Rockets, Wernher von Braun dropping V-2 rockets on London here, 1940s. We're stuck, 70 to 80 years retarded. So this is why our civilization is dying, because there are a bunch of petro-Nazis and kleptocrats that have kept this sort of thing secret, not because people are going to hurl themselves off the Big Ben because there's intelligent life out there. 75% of the public already thinks that there's likely intelligent life out there. In America, 43% of Americans believe ETs are already here on Earth somewhere. So I don't think it's going to be any huge shock. The shock is going to be to your 200 vertically and horizontally integrated corporate behemoths, Goldman Sachs and what have you, that are going to say goodbye to the $600 trillion in oil, gas, coal, nuclear power, utilities, internal combustion engines, jet engines. It's the end of the world as we know it, and the beginning of a new civilization. I'm using the REM song, it's the end of the world as we know it, but I feel fine. You know, you love that song? So, you know, it's like, okay, let's move on. But that's really the issue. So two issues that are behind the secrecy. One is ecclesiastical and paradigm. Where did we come from? How long have we had contact? From whence has Homo sapiens arisen? And the other one is just raw macroeconomic power. Because no cartel and power base wants to go the way of all flesh, which they would. They'd be like royal typewriters. You don't need them. Everybody's got a smartphone, hook up internet. All right? So it is a whole new beginning for our civilization, and that is something I'm on the side of advocating. There are other people who like me to be quiet. But what I think is really going to be important is that all of you spread the word. We get the funding in place to open a lab. Now people say, how are you going to get away with this more than Tesla did? I said, well, this is not the age of Tesla. We put this lab online and stream it on Ustream. And so when the Nazis come goose-stepping in with a national security order to seize it, we got gotcha on candid camera, screw you. And no, I mean, you know, there was this show, ABC News Nightline, I don't know if you've heard of it, Ted Koppel, a great guy. I was talking to him years ago about this. He says, well, what would you do if you acquired one of these technologies? I say, well, I'd come on all of these shows I've been on, like yours and Larry King's and all these, and I'd tear it up in front of millions of people and say, come and put on the handcuffs. You want to put the bracelets on? Be prepared to have Whitehall burned to the ground and the White House burned to the ground. People aren't going to stand for this once they see the solution. So, you know, our first line of defense is the masses. I don't mean to sound revolutionary, but hey, my family did help found the United States. No offense to the British, but love you. But my family were the first prisoner of war with the British. But I've forgiven you. Love all of you. Okay, so, true. So I think we have to look at, okay, our civilization has come to this point. And how did we get here? And what is the next chapter? Well, the next chapter is here. The future has arrived. It's just that people, A, don't know about it, and B, they don't know what to do about it. And so that's why, you know, what gave impetus to the film Sirius. But yes, you know, your question is very, very spot on into questioning everything. Yeah, another question. Yes, ma'am.
Where does nuclear fusion sit along this spectrum?
She's asking about nuclear fusion. It can be done, and of course you've heard of cold fusion, which actually has happened. Apparently Rossi in Italy may have such a device, but he won't disclose the mechanism of action. Huge strategic mistake. Anyone who knows Rossi, tell him to give me a jingle. You cannot do it. No. So, you know, if you're dealing with room temperature fusion or cold fusion, it can be done. It has to do with, again, very complex physics we won't go into here. But it's understood. What's more elegant are the electromagnetic systems, where you know, this is 220. In America, we have 110. You know, if I'm zapping someone with a defibrillator, it's a little more. But generally, our electrical systems are running in low voltage, high current. If you flip it around, where you have very high voltage, very low current, and do the voltage at certain resonant frequencies, it opens a Poynting vector, it's called, into the zero-point energy field. And this has been stumbled upon since the time of Faraday. Here, okay. So there's nothing new under the sun. The key is understanding the principles of the physics behind it. And once you have that, then you have to find people who have the courage to do it. Now, in the past, here's the problem, is that people have done this in a lab here and a lab there. I was just out in Las Vegas, and I was meeting with a man who worked for Lawrence Berkeley Labs, big defense laboratory. And he had worked on these projects. And he says, oh, yes. He says, we've had these for many decades. And he says, but even people in his lab who on their own would stumble across this would have folks come in and say, stop this experiment now. The third highest guy at the Naval Research Labs, which is the biggest Department of Defense lab in America, has been a friend of mine for many years, spent time at my home. His group created a high voltage system that created lift, and you had these things floating across the hangar there across from Reagan National Airport. If in the NRO you fly and you see these big radar domes, that's where that is. After spending about $1 million doing something that had been done by T. Townsend Brown in the 20s and Werner von Braun for Hitler in the 40s and had been perfected in 1954 by the national security aerospace industry in America, a little help from British Aerospace. This guy had a guy come in and say, you can't do this anymore, and they defunded it. He says, why not? He says, because we already have this elsewhere. So, unfortunately, technology, you know, one of the myths of our society is that we live in a free society with a free market. Well, if you're taking the most important technology breakthroughs of the last 100 years and sequestering them into classified programs, that's not a free market, is it? And who's benefiting from that? The usual folks who want to keep everything status quo, even if we destroy the biosphere. So yes, this kind of fusion you're asking about can happen. It's not the shortest path to this. The shortest path to this are the electromagnetic resonant systems that deal with the zero-point energy field. By the way, a guy who wrote for your defense journal, Jane's Defense Weekly, we turned on to this issue. He wrote the book, The Hunt for Zero Point. Nick Cook believe his name is. And great book, recommend it to you. And he discovered that, in fact, up until the early 50s, a lot of this was in the open literature in the aerospace journals, which also my uncle recalled. My uncle was the senior project engineer that built the funny thing that landed on the moon, the lunar module. You know what that is? Looks like a spider. Took Neil Armstrong to the moon. That was my uncle. His company was Grumman, became Northrop Grumman. And so this is an open secret with people like the head of the Lockheed Skunk Works, who told Jan Harzan, the IBM engineer you saw in the film, when he said, "Oh, we already have the means to take ET home." What did he mean? We already have trans-dimensional, faster than the speed of light technologies that are in the black projects, so-called black projects at Lockheed and at Northrop Grumman. We have them. Well, that's the good news. The bad news is, how the hell do you get them out to benefit humanity? Now, I think it has to be done in stages. The first stage would be something you're asking about. Something that would be an energy generation device that would bypass big utilities, that your home, car, business could run on. What I had have agreed with a colonel who is in charge of, here's a euphemism for you, future technologies for the Air Force, meaning the secret stuff they already have. They call it future, but it's not. It's back to the future. And I said, look, we want to do that first. And the stuff that flies, some of these things that you see that are UFOs are actually man-made, anti-grav stuff. Especially you go out to the desert Southwest, the outback of Australia, Alice Springs, Dugway Proving Grounds in Utah, Pahut Mesa, people call it Area 51, nobody calls it that, by the way, in the business, don't call it Area 51, no one calls it that. But those facilities have, Edwards facility, they have all this. Now, one of the things I put together for President Obama was an updated list of what I had given to Christopher Cox of the Congress and Bill Clinton and some of your leaders here. And that's a list of the facilities, project code names, code numbers, and specific projects dealing with this that date back, and they're still ongoing. So that actionable intelligence is one of the things I wanted to give to the current President of the United States at the request of a man who set up his administration for him, a man who's in favor of disclosure. His name is John Podesta. He actually put together Obama's cabinet. But the question becomes, they can find out about this stuff, but they don't have operational control over it. And so we're in a conundrum. I was talking to Chris Debney, who was here a moment ago, about this at the break, and well, we had a break, you didn't. I've seen the film. We were talking about the fact that this is something where you have a lot of people who want to know about it. No one wants to do anything about it. Don't conflate the two. Knowing is not doing. And one of the most chilling moments of my young adult life, I'm a young medical doctor, and I start the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and then we started the predecessor for the Worldwide Disclosure Movement. It was called Project Starlight, which actually the Clinton Presidential Library was forced under a lawsuit to release these documents. And I began to be invited up to Washington to brief various folks, including the CIA director, who later denied the meeting, but luckily I had documents proving we had it, caught him red, flat-footed and alive. I always say in Washington, how do you know they're lying? Their lips are moving. Oh, God, did I say that? Awful. True, but awful. So at the end of this 3-hour meeting, I have this white paper that's in my first book. You can get it at SiriusDisclosure.com. It's an ebook now. You just download it. We're making them all available for like $4.99 right now. You just put it on your iPad. And in this document, it was a set of actionable executive orders for the president. And he looked at me. He's going out the door with his wife, who happened to be the head of the National Academy of Sciences, chief operating officer, anyway. And she looks at me and he looks at me and says, "How do we disclose that which we have no access to?" And I'm thinking, well, this is, batshit crazy. You can't tell me the sitting CIA director doesn't have access to stuff that I heard about from whisperings in my aerospace family when I was 9 years old. And he said, no, they're not telling us anything. So even after we gave him all this information, what happened is that he ended up being basically strong-armed, and so did the president, and pushed. So the compartmented nature of intelligence is create a problem, and therefore the solution is not Whitehall or 10 Downing Street or 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. It's us. Now, what I can say now that I couldn't have said 10 years ago is that we have documents, previously seized patents, that's all I'm going to say, under national security orders, and scientists who've worked on this stuff, not whack jobs, that we could put together and do in probably 18 months to 24 months or less, a build-up of an energy generation system that would prove, as at least a proof of principle prototype. We need funding for it. The purpose of this film is to raise awareness about that. People say, well, why can't you just do that in your garage? I said, well, first of all, my wife has to hook up the DVD player. I'm such an idiot. So don't ask me to, I stick with defibrillators, respirators, and chest tubes. But the people who can do this, so we tried providing about $750,000 in grant funding to various scientists. As soon as they start getting close and they're working by themselves down near the Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, they get a knock on the door and they get threatened. So the divide and conquer motif is a real one. It's not a conspiracy theory. So we want to put these people together, have the public be aware of it, very aware of it, and do it as an open source project. And that's what we're doing. And but the fast track isn't going to be fusion. It's going to be these high voltage electromagnetic zero-point systems. Another question? Yes, ma'am. I'm not sure what your question is asking. I'm sorry.
Energy systems, these new electromagnetic energy systems.
Mm-hmm.
So you were talking about the Morning Star, and then you showed John Searle. And
Oh, well, these are people who are experimenting with these things. It was just to give people a sense of it. But not.
Same thing, the Morning Star?
No.
The SDG?
No, they're all different. And, you know, Dr. Bearden, who's a physicist down near the Huntsville Space Flight Center, and I talked about there's at least 18 different ways to approach how you get energy from the quantum vacuum zero-point energy field. And people stumble across this over the years. The problem becomes, how do you go from the breakthrough where you have the aha moment to where you can then get the resources and get it out? And the average physicist and engineer are going to be able to do that. That's why there has to be a mass grassroots movement behind it, in my opinion, in order for it to work. And that's what we're advocating to do. Yeah. Yes, sir.
We waste too much energy, especially with thermal power plants, and produce low temperature waste heat. Can you tell something about utilization of waste heat to produce electricity?
I don't understand the question. I don't know what raised heat is.
Waste heat.
Oh, waste
Transforming
heat.
waste heat into electricity.
Oh yeah, well there have been Stirling heat, electricity systems for years. The efficiency isn't very high. But again, you know, if you look at what was done with Stan Meyer, that was not a hoax. He actually had a car running on water. So you could take all the cars, adapt their engines, and they'd run on water by electrolyzing H2O, which are two burnable gases. And no, because you would the effluent, the tailpipe is water vapor, which you recirculate through a cooling. And so you're only pulling out the energy. Now, why did that work? The same reason why the barium titanate crystals at Lawrence Berkeley Labs that this man worked on, where you could put a certain voltage in at a certain resonant frequency, and you'd have 10 to 20 times more power out, because they would begin to resonate and pull energy from this structure of space-time, or the substructure in the zero-point field. So what they were doing with the water is that they were putting an electrical signal in, very high voltage. Unfortunately, he falsified the patents and took it to his grave exactly which frequencies, but there are two men who worked with him, that I know that we could put in our lab. And I think you could build that back up. So that would be what I call a transitional technology. It's something not that isn't just a free electromagnetic generator, but that would help transition all the internal combustion systems so we're not using oil, but using water. The other thing is that 2/3 of the surface of the Earth is covered with water. There's no shortage of water, there's shortage of potable water. But if you have free energy to do the electrolysis and create energy from water, and then you can do the desalinization using free energy and pump it, it's like what in the Bible it says, even the desert shall bloom. So all of these are fixable problems, and I think that it isn't going to be, as Einstein said, no problem is ever solved by the level of consciousness that created it. So the dinosaur era of fossil fuel mentality and linear physics, or even quantum physics, isn't going to solve this. It's the post-quantum stuff that, unfortunately, is been classified. I remember a few years ago I was given a talk at Cambridge, and there's an alleged high IQ group called Mensa. I tell people alleged. We're still looking for intelligent life here, aren't we? So they asked me to give a keynote, and I said, well, fine, I'll do it. So I go up there, and hundreds of people, and I give a presentation that's very not like this, very, here are the landing cases, here are the radar cases, the blah, blah, things that left brain linear people who think they're smart but aren't could get their minds around. I'm so direct, aren't I? Awful. Bony-headed academics, which is my family, but yeah, whatever. Real brilliance is consciousness. And so anyway, so at the end of my presentation, there was this octogenarian who was on all these committees for the British government. And it was a professor of physics at Cambridge, and he says, "Oh, how do you know that if any of this were true, I would have known about it?" Boing, with infinite and perfect British bombast. And love it. And I study it very carefully, how to be really fun. Anyway. And he went on to tell me that this was absolutely impossible, and that he was such an eminent physicist he would know about it. And then he said, "I find it utterly depressing that a man of your intelligence would be wasting your life on such drivel," in front of hundreds of people. I said, well, with all due respect, if there's a 10% chance that any of this is true, it's the biggest change in human history. I don't think it's drivel. Next question. What was interesting, afterwards we had sort of a banquet in one of those old halls with the torches, lit with, it was really beautiful. And, the usual rubber chicken routine. And banquet. And I was late for another meeting, so I left, and I heard these people running after me. I looked behind, and here are these young PhD sort of understudies for this professor. And they said, "We want to apologize for Dr. I don't remember his name, so-and-so." And I said, "That's okay." They said, "Well, you scared him." I said, "Oh, I didn't mean to imply that these visitors were hostile. We know that they're not. That's just the poppycock of Hollywood and the UFO nuts." And he said, "Well, it wasn't that. He thought what you were saying might be true, and it meant that his whole career had been wasted, and that the real action was going on in a classified world that he had no access to." I said, "I understand." So they were sent to apologize for this guy. So what you find is that there is a future shock element to this, because we are 50 to 100 years behind the curve. And it's difficult to deliver this message. I have the dubious task of sitting on an island in the Great Barrier Reef next month. I've been invited to address 120 world leaders. Last year, the Director of National Intelligence for America was there. And I can't mention it beyond this, but to say that they've asked me to address them on this issue because they realize we're killing our planet. And the main focus is energy. So keep a good thought for us next month in Australia. So we're hoping that eventually a critical mass will be reached in the public, but also with some of these world leaders who, by the way, it's not like there's some vast conspiracy like so many people know about this. You can walk through the E-ring of the Pentagon. E-ring is where all the generals and admirals are. It's the outer ring because they have views. That was the site hit by the alleged plane that hit on 9/11. Anyway, Or Rumsfeld and all those guys. Well, you could walk around the E-ring, and out of the hundreds of flag officers, there might be a couple who know about this. It's so compartmented. So people have a very incorrect idea about how government works, corporations work, and TSSCI, Top Secret Special Compartmented Intelligence. And when you Q clearance or nuclear launch stuff, well, this stuff is like 38 compartments past nuclear launch. It really is. And that's the problem, because in America, a couple years ago, I had some people who were sent over by the president of France, Sarkozy. His Ministry of Defense had written a letter to me saying that they felt it was time for us to make peaceful contact with the ETs. And we did a little project there, a 2,200-acre estate in Brittany. And they tracked objects coming over us on a vector at 200,000 kilometers an hour, and some of them stopping, and some of them transdimensionally shifting into the field. Amazing stuff. Now, the admiral who wrote to me sent some folks over after this to meet with us in Washington. And they said, well, why can't the president or some folks in Washington just get this going, because we don't want to leapfrog ahead of the U.S. defense establishment? I said, who? The emperor has no clothes. And I began to explain that in America, we are now spending around $1 trillion a year on the Department of Defense, CIA, Homeland Security, NSA, etc. Trillion. The amount that is estimated, as you heard from Donald Rumsfeld 12 years ago, he said there's $2.3 trillion unaccounted for. Well, right now there's between 100 and 200 billion every year missing. My friends, that is larger than the defense budget of the United Kingdom or France or China or Russia. That's in the black budget of the United States. It's an absolute disaster. And if you think that there's anyone in the Oval Office of Congress that has a handle on that, notwithstanding their assertions during the Snowden mess, you're in a fantasy world. They do not have a handle on it, not on this stuff. So that is the problem. It's a completely dysfunctional, broken system. And what I concluded before I went public with a lot of this at the National Press Club in 2001 was that the solution isn't going to be in the leadership. It's going to be with the people. We're doing disclosure. We're going to make contact. We're going to put these technologies together. We're going to bring them out. It's up to all of us. That's it.
I'm very interested in these groups that you run, where people sit and they use their own energy to connect. I personally have connected on several occasions, and really the communication system is respect and love.
Correct. Well, and understanding the nature of consciousness.
Have you set groups up here already?
Yes, there are. And unfortunately, our app, if you have a smartphone, there's a contact app you can download that has the whole remote viewing course, meditation course, turns your phone into a magnetic field meter, the whole bit. Go to SiriusDisclosure.com. The one thing it's missing is a social networking component. And since we have no full-time staff, we can't do that for folks. What I'm hoping we can do in version 2.0 of this app is to get it linked into a social networking thing. So let's say that you're in Wiltshire. You can get on there, and people who want to opt in will be linked to you like you would on Twitter or Facebook or what have you. So we don't have that right now, and we don't have any staff to coordinate people. So what I tell people is you can learn the protocols, practice them, and form your own group of 3, 4, 5, 6 people. You don't want to cast the thousands anyway, because coherence is hard to maintain once you go past about 8 people. Now, the training events I used to do it with 100 people. Now it's cut to about 25 people. And even that is Promethean, to keep 25 primates on the same page for 7 nights under the stars till 2 in the morning. I'm starting that on Saturday in Wiltshire. Oi. So, but I think that, everyone can learn to do this. What's really key to this, by the way, this is the part of my work that's been the most defamed and least understood. And yet, the reason I was ushered in to brief the CIA director is because they knew that we had made contact. And they knew that in 1992, when 4 of these ET craft got vectored in at Pensacola Beach. So I think folks have to understand that this is something that every person can do. Why? Every person is conscious and sentient. Everyone has a beating heart. They can learn to be aware of just awareness. And when they do that, they can then enter into a silent state and intend to see remote places. And the research on this is very strong. Now, you know, the intelligence community have used this, and they call it remote viewing for spy purposes. What I suggest is that we do it for universal peace purposes, that everyone consider themselves citizens of Earth, diplomats to other star systems, because they're here. And what's amazing is that if you make half of a step in that direction, the universe is going to open the door to contact. And I think it's clear that, you know, I remember Larry King asking me, why don't they just land on the White House lawn? Oh, God, if I had one more person in the media ask me that. I said, well, who's frickin' White House? The White House in Bogota? Why not 10 Downing Street? Or Hyde Park? Or Kensington Palace? Say hi to the new babe. Lovely. I think that there's all kinds of things. But that's not how they're thinking. Because I tried that when they met with Eisenhower in 1954 at Muroc, near Edwards Air Force Base. A French government admiral, a military admiral, sent to me a document that proved that that event actually happened. But what did we do? Eisenhower lost control of what he famously called the military-industrial complex. We then betrayed the whole initiative, and it's been a disaster since then. So there too...
Did he make contact with them? Did he make any deals with them? Did there anything happen since
No,
then?
there were no deals made, but there was an opening that happened that then went sideways.
And where was the race from?
And where was the
race extraterrestrials from that made contact with them?
I don't know what star system they were from.
That's quite
But they were, you know, tall. The point I'm making, and by the way, this was right in the area. This was right in the. Please don't scream out. This was right in the area where Gordon Cooper's team had filmed the landed craft, as you all know, in 1956. You all know the story. And Gordon Cooper, the early Mercury astronaut, put that on a plane that was flown back to the Pentagon. So, you know, between the 40s and the 50s, particularly in areas where we were doing a lot of atomic testing, nuclear weapons development, and what is euphemistically called directed energy weapon development, which is how we shot down Roswell. Roswell did not crash. That was a directed energy weapon targeting. We've just discovered also that there is one in San Antonio, New Mexico, not Texas, right adjacent to the Trinity site, where there was a crash in August of 1945, right after we had dropped the first atomic weapon on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So, you know, there's a whole history here that you have to kind of parse through and find people who know what happened. But the initiatives that had been taken, I think, went very bad. Because the people who really took charge were people who were interested in the acquisition of power and were looking at this situation through military-colored glasses. You know, if you have rose-colored glasses, the whole world is pink. So unfortunately, I think that was the big mistake. The big mistake, and military people have admitted this to me, was militarizing the situation from the get-go, which I think Eisenhower's instincts were to not do so. But by then, later in his administration, he lost control of the issue, which is why he famously said in his exit farewell speech to the world, beware the military-industrial complex, which will be a threat to our democracy and our way of life. And I think that's why, ultimately, it's all gotten passed on out of those very powerful circles into our labs, not my lab, heaven forbid, but all of us together. So what you're asking about, madam, very important. Everyone should take responsibility for contact. Everyone should take responsibility for gathering people together to support bringing out these new technologies and for disclosure. In this city, there are dozens of military and intelligence people who know about this issue who should be invited to come out, which is what we've done with the Disclosure Project. Certainly there are a lot of British aerospace people who've known over the years. The people who know are usually your mid-level operatives and not necessarily your leaders. And this I learned, as I mentioned, the hard way in America. But let me tell you a little story. We're in Great Britain. I just landed yesterday, so I'm quite jet lagged. Am I making any sense at all? Yes. You had a Minister of Defense named Lord Hill Norton, wonderful man, and five-star admiral. They used to call him Sea Lords. And he had his home out, what he called his cottage, out in Hampshire. So he found out about what I was doing and invited me to come and meet with him at his home. And I said, certainly I will. And my wife and 4 kids were over here with me that year. And I said, go to Salisbury Cathedral or someplace and have fun. I have something to do. Life at home is interesting with me. Can you imagine being raised? Anyway, couldn't have been easy being raised this way. God bless my kids and 6 grandkids. 7th on the way. Scary thought, me being a grandfather. Can you imagine? Horrifying, really. So, you know, here I am with, you know, your former Minister of Defense, who was head of MI5, MI6, military committee, head of the military committee for NATO. And he informs me, just as the CI director, he says, I was never told anything about this as Minister of Defense. I said, of course not. He said, and he was furious and scared. And there's a private, I talk about this now because he's passed away. And I think on the other side he doesn't mind me talking about this. But he was really furious. He says, and he turned to me, he says, well, will you give me what you were being provided? I said, yes, and I brought him this 500-page briefing document that we put together for the president and folks. And the best that I could do in my spare time between shooting, stabbings, car wrecks, and heart attacks in the ER, and raising 4 kids. But I said, look, yeah. So I said, look, I'm going to answer your question with a question. What would you have done if you had found out that there was a deep national security state program that engaged in assassinations, kept things secret from the constitutional appointed authorities, and had within their technology the means for getting the world out of poverty, pollution, and onto a sustainable track for thousands of years? He looked at me, he said, I wouldn't stick for one bloody moment. He was like this tall, his steely blue-eyed, amazing guy, awesome. And I said, that's why they didn't tell you. And he looked at me. I said, the first thing they do before they let you into cosmic ops, magic ops, magi, the document, I could go through this whole document I have, blackjack control, is they do a soul biopsy. They look and see if you're willing to go along with the agenda of the secrecy. If you are, you may or may not be, like Bush Sr., CI director, and you'll know. Or you may be like Woolsey and not know. You may or may not be a president that will be told a little bit to manipulate you into Star Wars, like President Reagan. Or you may know nothing and won't be told anything, like Bill Clinton, who ended up going to the Rockefeller Ranch to hang out with Paul Davids and this document I put together. And a good friend of his says, yes, that document, she used to live at the west wing of the White House with the family, and she says he kept it on the back of his toilet, and he would sit there going through. And he brought it out in the living quarters once, and was going through, and Bill Clinton was going through this thing, and it had all these documents and testimony from astronauts. He says, oh, I know all this is true, but they won't tell me a thing, not a goddamn thing. That's from someone who lived in the White House with Bill Clinton. So it isn't as simple as people think. Everyone thinks there's this vast conspiracy. Well, yes and no. But the folks who are involved are not the usual suspects. Sometimes they are, usually not. It's mostly been corporatized, privatized. The real action, corporate. Lockheed Martin, my uncle's old company, Northrop Grumman, SAIC, MITRE Corporation, Atlantic Research Corporation, on and on and on. We know who they are. Now, are there compartment operations in the intelligence community? Yes. In the Department of Defense? Yes. Are there some here in the UK? Absolutely. But it doesn't mean that your Minister of Defense or Prime Minister has been read into them, or briefed, they call it read into the military talk. So I think we have to have a lot of open-mindedness and not come to facile conclusions about, whenever I meet someone, I take everything at face, without prejudice. Because that person may or may not know. But I've learned the hard way that just because you're on the Senate Intelligence Committee, or an MOD head, or a member of some royal families, doesn't mean you know anything. You might know, you may not know. And what we have to do is say, what can we put together to make this lift easier for them? Because ultimately, the very American idea, if the people will lead, the leaders will follow. And we're the people. Yes, you had a question here. Yes, sir.
Yes. One of the things I noticed omitted from the film.
Oh, there's a lot. 99.9%.
But one of the schools of thought that's out there, I'm not saying I agree with it necessarily, is that that the government agencies have been in contact with extraterrestrials that don't necessarily have Earth's best interests at heart.
Yeah, that is the very popular position, and my information is they'd like you to think so. Now, one of the confusions on this is a lot of these creatures that have been seen, how far into the deep end of the pond do you want to go here? There's a whole section of this movie that was left out because the director felt it was too controversial, as if the rest of this isn't. But also there wasn't enough time to go into it. That should be the next version. All right, there are 5 more versions of this, 2.0, 3.0. Back a number of decades ago, they began to develop creatures that look like they're ETs and they're man-made. These are made at Dulce, they're made at the Edwards Complex, Alice Springs. And those are the ones that have been involved in electronic warfare systems, what the public call abductions and mutilations. Now, those are man-made systems. They have integrated circuits in their neural content. A number of years ago, when I started this, I didn't believe this, by the way, in the early 90s, and I began to meet people who'd worked in those projects. And I then had someone give me a Strategic Studies Institute, very elite institute in America, document that outlined the psychological warfare of creating the specter of at least one or more hostile ET civilizations, what Werner von Braun said, so that people would learn to hate. Now, if you understand how power is played, where there's been demagogues in religion, politics, warmongers, if you want to control the masses around something that is truly controlling, you use fear. And that is exactly what Adolf Hitler did in scapegoating Jews and what have you, and other minorities, gay people, gypsies. So basically the agenda for about 50 years has been to create the specter of a threat from outer space. And to do that, they began to create systems that would be very convincing. Now in 1993-94, when I discovered this, a man told me, if you tell people the truth about this, A, they're going to hate you, because people love to have someone to hate. You can't take that from them. And B, they won't believe it, because the truth is 10 times more bizarre than the fiction that we're going to spoon-feed people. And ultimately, that's my biggest concern. About 100 times a week, my wife and I talk about shutting down all my efforts in this area, in this whole subject, because so much of what I've done has been hijacked by people trying to make hay that there's a threat from outer space, which is exactly what Werner von Braun warned us about on his deathbed. The quickest way to do that is to portray that there are civilizations out there that are here to eat us for lunch. And actually, there was a Lockheed Martin group of scientists who just published a book 2 years ago to that effect. And why? Because how do you control the world? You know, as Leon Panetta said, we're spending $110 billion a year to chase 70 Al-Qaeda out in Afghanistan. 70. This is a quote. Go look it up. Leon Panetta, CIA director that I know, who was the CIA director who then became Secretary of Defense. So he was the first CIA director for Obama. And unfortunately, if you have to create this specter of fear. So I think there's a lot of disinformation out there wrapped inside the information that is trying to hit the aspects of humans that want to be afraid of something.
It's about
Okay.
keeping it regular.
And you know, I think that this is complex and difficult. I remember some years ago meeting with the Crown Prince of Liechtenstein, Hans von Liechtenstein. It was an amazing meeting. And he turned to me and he says, the reason I'm providing funding to various groups looking into the abduction issue is that, and he was the chief funder of Vote This Day, is that I really think we have to have an enemy in space. So we have a final eschatological, end-of-the-world battle in space that will force the return of Christ. Now this is the Crown Prince of Liechtenstein, from his lips to my ears, and I'm going, whoo-hoo, Nutsville. I mean, I'm going, really? You know? But remember, that family also funded Adolf Hitler, right? The Liechtenstein banking fortune. So I think that you have to begin to look at what is the agenda. On the other hand, if there was a group of civilizations, or a civilization, that wanted to do us in, it would have been done 1945 before we detonated the first atomic weapon. Now, I know my position on this is the least popular because everyone does need to have some new entity to hate. And I think one of the problems with humans is that we've gone from racism, tribalism, misogyny, sectarian violence, where we're still there. And the next big thing is what I call exophobia. So, you know, forget homophobia, it's exophobia. Let's find someone new that we have to be afraid of. Now, there are people in the intelligence community who are all too happy to play on those proclivities and rather atavistic tendencies that are latent within humans to be afraid of otherness. And I think that we have a choice to make. And the choice is this: universal peace or extinction. There's no way we're going to go forward from where we are now with international and intertribal and sectarian violence and replace that with interplanetary conflict. Now, who would benefit from there being interplanetary conflict? The usual suspects. The people who want to grow the trillion-dollar defense sector into 2 or 3 or 4 trillion a year. But also maintain, more importantly, it isn't the money, the power and control over people, because fear is the mind killer. So I would warn people, to at least give, I know it sounds terribly 60s, give universal peace a chance. And I will say one other thing about that. Let's say that that position is true, because I can't prove a negative. It's axiomatic, right? You can't prove a negative. Anyway, but getting late. We're going into my scientific theory. But if you can't prove a negative, let's assume that there is, for argument's sake. I don't believe there's evidence. There's evidence for hoaxing and creating scary things that are these artificial life forms that look robotic, move like this, stand Roman X footage. That's a programmed form, robotic. Looks like a gray. It's not. We put them on an anti-gravity vehicle that we've been flying around since the 50s, and 99.9999999% of you would think it was an ET, and it's not. But let's assume there's 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 species out there that are. You're going to solve this problem down the barrel of a laser, or through a particle beam weapon, or electromagnetic weapon system? No. You're going to solve it through contact, dialogue, interplanetary relations, universal peace. And the recognition that the light of consciousness within everyone is a singularity, the singularity of mind. And so going beyond the duality and the conflict, because when you're dealing with civilizations that are faster than the speed of light, therefore are transdimensional, which means that they're dropping out of linear space-time, moving through another dimension in a space-time bubble that can be created through very high voltage systems. If they were hostile, it would be point set match in a 0.01 nanosecond. So you're not going to solve this problem through, jingoism and fear-mongering and paranoia and creating another enemy. the solution would be the same thing I'm recommending with the CE5 initiative. Contact, and rather than sitting in your computer screens, ingesting conspiracy garbage off the internet, I would suggest you go out into your beautiful countryside and make contact. That would be my recommendation. Yes, sir.
Regarding the little understood nature, true nature of reality, with regards to all-in-one